Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to this industry briefing for the broader workplace supplies category, but in particular a discussion about the first activities within that category around office supplies. And I'd like to open the briefing firstly by acknowledging that it's taking place on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So in terms of the agenda for today, what I'm going to do firstly is just, set the scene around the government's overarching procurement reform agenda and how then some of the things that we're looking at in the refresh of this and other contract arrangements reflects that particular drive. We'll talk very briefly about some of the background. You're very familiar, I'm sure, with some of the existing contract features and to be honest, some of its shortcomings, and we'll certainly talk about how we've taken some of that feedback on board. We'll look at the proposed strategy at a high level and then talk in particular about a couple of highlights within that specifically focused around office supplies. Then I think also talk about what from our perspective, some of the benefits, and it'll be useful to test some of that with you today. And what are the opportunities that are coming out of our new procurement platforms like NSW Buy for you as a supplier community to be far more effectively engaged and promoted throughout the government sector. We'll talk about timelines and then we'll try to move through, I guess, the formal part of the presentation, if you like, as quickly as possible so that we've got as much opportunity for some dialogue and some questions and answers. It's important, to me in particular for this briefing that you do have an opportunity to engage with us and ask some of those questions and raise some of those points. We'll talk at that stage. There are obviously a number of different channels that you can use for providing some of that feedback. So the government's overarching procurement reform agenda, in particular driven with the change of government, really was looking at refocusing the procurement system as a whole to deliver better outcomes from an overall perspective for the state. And it's linked very, very specifically to the state plan objectives. So it does look at the way in which procurement can contribute to rebuilding state finances. I think importantly for you as a supplier community, one of the things that we've been actively working our way through, particularly through the early parts of this year as we refresh contract arrangements, is looking at the opportunities for reducing red tape, simplifying administration, simplifying the application processes, the tendering processes that you as suppliers have traditionally had to go through to be able to engage successfully with government. We are actively looking at the opportunities for promoting competition across the sector as a whole, and also looking very closely at the ways in which we can better engage with the small and medium enterprise communities. And we recognise that historically many of our contract arrangements have been such that they've effectively locked a whole sector out. And that included things not only like the way in which we went to market, but also the nature of things like insurances and some of those types of features that really made it very, very difficult for the small, medium enterprise sector to be actively engaged. There are a couple of key features of the reform. During last year, one of the first things that happened in legislation was the establishment of the New South Wales Procurement Board. Now that's important. Some of you may have been familiar that in the past we had a State Contracts Control Board, and a predominant difference with the new governance structure under the Procurement Board is that board's comprised of the Directors General of the principal departments. So you actually have the heads of departments that are accountable for delivery of outcomes within the system overall, responsible at that level for helping to drive and make policy and reform decisions, and also then to provide strategic direction for the sector as a whole, and certainly for us within the Department of Finance and Services in the work that we're doing to try and enable some of those outcomes that we were talking about earlier. One of the first things that the Procurement Board established was the Strategic Direction Statement, and the Strategic Direction Statement set out in the order of about an 18-month work program that was specifically designed around driving some of the things that I've been talking about. So how do we ensure that we bring in some strategic and agile procurement practices? How do we make sure that we encourage better ways of participation with industry sectors in different markets, small, medium enterprises. How do we ensure that we innovate and implement new approaches to the way in which we manage categories, and not necessarily just through forums like these, but also more targeted ways in which we can better engage with industry to help us design the sorts of outcomes that are actually required for frontline service delivery across the sector. So just touching very, very briefly then, if you think about some of that, I guess messaging and what we're trying to achieve, you should be able to hold us to account as we talk through the strategy and say, okay, well, are there features of what we're trying to do that actually build on what I've just been talking about? So I won't spend overly long talking about the background. As I said, many of you, if not most of you, would be familiar with the existing contract. It was originally put in place for a 3-year period with a couple of options. It had, at its establishment, 16 suppliers across a multiple range of lots. And I'll talk in a moment about certainly what we took away and learnt from the operation of that contract, both with your feedback and the feedback from our agency customers and buyers, as to where some of the opportunities were in our fresh thinking for going back into the market this time around. As I said, there were a number of ways in which we gathered feedback, both doing quite detailed and comprehensive reviews within the Department of Finance and Services and more broadly with some of the other agency participants. We also did seek industry feedback, and we sought to look at the ways in which we could think about the refresh of these contract arrangements, taking some of that feedback on board. So just having a look at some of that, I think as many of you would be aware, one of the, predominant drivers at that time for the approach that was taken was to try and, facilitate outcomes so that a large agency, the likes of a health or an education, for instance, would then be able to engage within that contract structure and establish arrangements that made sense for their particular supply chain. And the way in which ultimately the contract was structured actually didn't deliver that outcome, and quite the reverse. It made it very complicated for agency buyers to be able to get and source relationships in a way that actually supported the supply chains that they had in place for distribution of these particular sorts of product categories into their environments. The other component of it that we certainly have taken actively on board is that at the time we recognised that there were some real issues in the cataloguing strategy and what was available to us from a cataloguing point of view and the way that we went about trying to implement that. And obviously that has two impacts. It impacts you as suppliers in being able to effectively work with us, have products visible, available and displayed in a catalogue in a way that encourages participation from an agency buyer. It creates, if it's not implemented effectively, additional administrative burdens both on your part and on our part in trying to work through some of those processes. And ultimately, from an agency buyer point of view, it means that you don't get to the sorts of outcomes where as a buyer you can quickly and easily understand and source and see what's available on a particular contract and where at any point in time might be the best solution for you in terms of being able to get that delivered. We do recognise that at the time, I think, and that's something that we're keen to work through with you in this process, is the nature of the approach to the market, and some of those some of those outcomes that were achieved actually reflected the fact that could have been more effectively designed at the time. And we wanted to make sure that we created opportunities, as I've said, for SMEs, particularly in this approach, recognising again that the last contract structure didn't necessarily provide that sort of opportunity, particularly for small, medium, but also regional and remote suppliers. Notwithstanding the fact that we do have, some exemption type policies like local schools, local decisions, and also the ability for small regional buyers to buy up to a particular threshold without necessarily having to engage in a state contract process. But looking at all of those, features, recognising that there were still some things that we could do as we thought about this new contract. Our objectives really were to move from single product offerings and a structure of contract that really didn't deliver outcomes that were effective either for suppliers or for agency buyers, to create effectively three separate lots of arrangements that dealt with the logical groupings based on the feedback that we've had, logical groupings of particular areas of those categories. to look at the opportunity for facilitating one-stop shop style availability, particularly for the core office supplies components, to also allow and make sure that we had effective processes within the contract for agencies to be able to run RFQs and commit volumes, either as an individual agency, but also in other of our arrangements now we have the ability to aggregate demand on a whole of sector or a multiple agency level, and so again create fresh opportunity within the existing contract arrangements to drive some better outcomes. We've removed, as part of both the process of extensions within the existing contract, but certainly going forward into the new contract structures, we've removed management fee, and that was certainly something that was an onerous administrative burden, both for you as suppliers and for us as well, to be honest, in the way that we went about having to design systems to go about collecting that. I've talked about SMEs, and we'll touch on in a moment that what we're looking at increasingly and have done in other category sectors is use pre-qualification schemes, so much simpler processes for suppliers to register themselves and express their interest in being a supplier to government. And we've done that now successfully across a number of categories with both a great level of participation and interest and some really good early outcomes and feedback in other industry sectors. So we're certainly looking at taking those lessons on board and applying them within this particular category. And threading through that, as I've said, looking at the ways in which we can reduce administrative overhead and administrative burden, both through better effective design of the overall contract, but also the cataloguing systems that support it. Touched on that in the discussion about what agencies were able to do, and I think, as many of you know, we previously had a very restrictive best price clause, which, to be honest, in operation have never seemed to work terribly well or effectively, and in most cases have a perverse outcome, which is that the industry says, well, we're not going to, give someone a particular price because we don't want to potentially, have to replicate what might be a complex supply chain for delivery to a large customer, to a very, very small agency. From our perspective, having to argue what are the similarities between different types of suppliers. So it was really, particularly in the operation of this contract, there are some spaces where it's linked to benchmarking opportunities, for instance, in some of the ICT sectors where it does work and have some merit, but certainly wasn't seen as being effective here. As I've talked about, agency, the nature of the outcomes that we achieved in the previous contract meant that agencies weren't actually able to go through a process and decide or agree on a single relationship for a core component of their delivery. They were effectively forced to deal with multiple suppliers, and so that creates, certainly for some of the larger agencies, some diseconomies for them in the way that they're actually able to source those products, and also doesn't allow for some of the effective supplier relationship management to develop, where both you as a supplier to government get to work more proactively and help to drive outcomes that can reduce your costs of supply and help to create better outcomes for you as suppliers. There was segmentation under the previous contract around the environmental products. Again, that was a difficult outcome within that contract. And so what we're looking at in this particular refresh are what are the opportunities for us to create better space for aggregation and better meet some of the agency requirements in a way that's facilitated and delivers an effective process for you to participate in. The one-stop shop concept, as I've said, recognising that that's a fairly consistent approach in other sectors, not only the public sector, and the opportunities that creates both for your suppliers and for us in reducing administrative overhead and reducing some of the burdens in being able to deliver to a particular agency buyer. We are, as part of the overall reforms from a whole of sector point of view, ensuring that we create opportunities for piggybacking so that agencies have the ability to participate in the sector if they're not potentially looking at, say, engaging in a preferred supplier agreement within their own right, but they'll have some means by which they can participate in the contract outcomes. We're looking at using the facilities that are now available under our NSW Buy platform, and it's worth noting that in particular at the moment education has done a very, very good job of taking what is our common platform, the NSW Buy platform, and its cataloguing outcomes, and really being able to drive and deliver a cataloguing solution, particularly for areas like this, that allows for much more effective catalogue management design from a supplier point of view, and also allows for a better experience from a buyer's point of view. And so what we're looking at being able to facilitate are means by which you can regularly use that system to promote both yourselves overall, promote spot opportunities as they arise, and have a way of interacting within the system that you wouldn't have had available to you under previous versions of the contract. So at this stage, the proposed contract structure, and I use the term proposed because a couple of things, I'll touch on it in a bit more detail later, but as some of you would be aware, we've actually released a draft of the current proposed tender documentation on the e-tendering site. And we did that very deliberately in advance of this conversation, so that there is an opportunity for you as suppliers and as industry to give us some early feedback, because we don't want to either go through the process ourselves or take you through a complicated tender process. It takes time and cost and investment to do that. So we'd rather get some initial feedback to make sure that we've got the broad design correct, and if there are some features in there that, based on your individual feedback, and what we're talking about trying to achieve from an objectives perspective, you don't think will be achieved by that particular approach to the market, then that's the sort of feedback that we like, because we'll take the opportunity based on that feedback as well as any discussion that we have today, and we'll incorporate that in the final design of go-to-market documentation. And I think that's a more effective way for us to look at doing that. So in the current proposals around the contract structure, we're looking at office supplies, and if you were familiar with all of the various lots, it covers a range of those existing lots, so the predominant core of the office supplies components. A janitorial and kitchen and canteen products, which replaces the bulk purchase under those other lot mappings. Office furniture, which is effectively a straight replacement for what was the existing Lot 8. And then we're looking at the introduction, as I said, of pre-qualification schemes to cover a mix initially of product sets, but certainly something that we would look at and get feedback around as to the opportunity to expand those. So in the first case, a couple of specific educational schemes for general and arts and crafts, and then also a scheme for promotional and customised products, a scheme around toners and inkjets, and also stationers, so small stationers. We recognise that throughout the sector as a whole, and certainly in some of the regional remote, there are small stationer suppliers that potentially could be locked out of a large office supplies arrangement. And so what we want to facilitate through the use of pre-qualification schemes is the ability for those types of suppliers to register and be able to provide products and services within a particular category set. So that basically that just shows graphically what I've just stepped through. So you've got an overarching workplace supplies category, which includes not only these areas, office supplies, janitorial, and some of the others, but also picks up within our existing contract arrangements things like industrial hardware, progressively electronic whiteboards, and a range of things that logically group together in what you would describe as a category of workplace supplies. The first phase of that is looking at the office supplies component, and as I've described, a mix between having the capacity and the capability to deliver through one-stop shop arrangements, as well as pre-qualification schemes to support some of the other categories and provide for some of those opportunities for small, medium enterprise, regional and remote providers. And then from a phase 2 perspective, then looking at the implementation of the other categories, so the janitorial type products and then also the office furniture. So in just trying to, from our perspective, I guess at this stage, have a look at what we think are some areas of highlight in discerning the approach that we're taking. We are looking at, from a response back from market, ensuring that the prices that are tendered are maximum prices, and that then both agencies and yourselves have an opportunity to engage through processes where you then may decide that you're able to offer something that puts you in a better competitive position with a particular agency or provider. We've removed the lots. We recognise that under the previous contract structure, the sort of outcomes that we'd achieved by trying to break the overall category down to such specific elements didn't necessarily result in the outcomes that we either expected or that matched some of the industry feedback from a supply point of view, and some of the agency feedback as well. Agencies within this arrangement will be able to establish preferred supply agreements, so that's feedback that we've had very strongly, that certainly some of the larger agencies want to be able to, on the basis of their committed volume, move into a longer term relationship with a particular supplier or group of suppliers, and they'll have that flexibility, and that's intended to be facilitated through this contract. We're going to use a basket of goods approach. That's the proposal at this stage. And what we've looked at is in the order of about 500 of both the most common high volume, most likely to need to be catalogued types of products, rather than try and go through a different mechanism, and do that on a basis that then allows us to very quickly from implementation establish a core set of products and where it's necessary related services, so that the cataloguing functions are available immediately, and both you as suppliers get some traction and the agencies can immediately start to buy. We're looking at, for the non-basket of goods type categories, just being able to do simple mechanisms like provide percentage off list or whatever the most consistent means of dealing with that, but to do that again in a way that doesn't require extensive contract administration and overhead or administration from your point of view in terms of being able to update catalogues. We're looking at also, as I've said, making sure that we've got provision for finance and services through New South Wales procurement to conduct aggregated RFQs on behalf of the sector. This is an approach that we've used quite successfully, for instance, in other categories like motor vehicles, where on a periodic basis we'll commit a certain volume of demand for the sector and go out to the market, and that creates another fresh opportunity at that point in time, both from our perspective in terms of driving some volume, but also in the feedback we've had in that space has been positive from an industry point of view. It also gives you the opportunity to better enable and manage to an aggregated and committed volume of expenditure, and gives you some certainty around that. And from a catalogue design point of view, I mean, this is something that we've been doing effectively as of now through the developments on the new NSW Buy platform, but we'll certainly create a facility whereby agencies are able to punch out from the NSW Buy platform into supply catalogue structures, and obviously we need to do some work together when we're implementing those things to make sure that that works. But the intent overall is that we keep, if you like, the core of the platform or the system as it currently stands within a DFS perspective, and help then to facilitate both with agencies and suppliers the way in which individual catalogues can be established. And as I said, education, for those of you who might be familiar with it already, have been doing a lot of good work in that space, so there's a lot of learning that we can take out of that. I guess this is our perspective, and you'll soon give us feedback as to whether you see, in that there are particular benefits from your point of view. But what we're trying to do is to make sure that both the design of the new contract, the way that we approach the market, the way that we talk to you in respect of what we're trying to achieve, does actually better align to the way that you're currently organised, the way that you're currently delivering, both to this and to other sectors. We do want to also create opportunities through this arrangement to look at how we can maximise drop sizes and distribution networks, reduce order frequencies, and some of those sorts of things that, on both of our perspectives, add cost and administrative overhead into the system overall, and are ways in which we think you can, by working with us on that basis, get additional benefits. We want to make sure, as I said, we've already taken management fee out, and I think that's a big positive step. We've had some good feedback around that. But we also want to have a look at any other component of the way in which we're engaged in this category that actually creates additional administration, red tape, and look at ways of working with you to help try and minimise or eliminate that. We've talked about what we're trying to achieve by the creation of one-stop shop type providers, and we think that that also has some potentially some benefits for you as an industry. SMEs in particular, I think there's a good opportunity through the sorts of schemes that we introduce as of day one, but then also subsequently when we look at ways in which we can promote participation from SMEs in a genuine way that allows them to both register and start to be successful for securing government business. I've talked about the removal of the management fee. And I guess as a final point on that, we do want to also allow for and create awareness, as a component of our broader SME strategy. We certainly want to create opportunities for those organisations that are either disability service providers or Aboriginal Indigenous providers, either in their own right or through partnership arrangements, and create ways in which we can better promote that through the procurement system overall. Just a couple of quick points, and won't get into that in too much detail, but on the way that the new NSW Buy platform's been designed, it does actually allow you as a supplier to have access to and some input into your own catalogue content, and to be able to use that as one of, obviously, a number of channels that you can access to be able to engage with the sector as a whole, and certainly with agency buyers. You'll be able to and can currently update content on the New South Wales Buy e-catalogues, and we also promote and make supplier information available through the e-tendering sites. And we're using now within the e-tendering system an e-quote functionality. Agencies can use that for running short RFQ processes. And that's another channel that we'll look at as to how we can best take advantage of that, and you'll be able to participate in that through that particular process. Now, just some timeframes. So obviously we're having a briefing today. We have put a draft of the office supplies tender documentation as it currently stands out on the e-tendering site, and we're looking to try and gather that feedback into next week. And that gives us an opportunity then to either go back and have some further consultation, or if we need to have a look at areas in which we might want to make some improvements before we then issue. We're targeting at this stage, and while these are obviously fairly firm dates, we're targeting that we'll have the first component of the overall packages for office supplies released on the 3rd of July. We'll conduct, obviously at that time, a more specific tender briefing, as opposed to what we're talking about today, which is an overview briefing, and to some extent qualified to take an opportunity to get some early feedback from you around that. We are looking at this stage at being in a position to move through that process of evaluation and award at this stage by November, and look at contracts being in place certainly no later than the 1st of April. And obviously if there's opportunities from both of our perspectives to bring forward or ensure that we get some better outcomes by delivering on that in an earlier time frame, then that's certainly something that we'll look to achieve. At this stage, there's still some thinking going on around janitorial, kitchen and canteen. So we're looking at potentially at this stage having some documentation out and available in around the August time frame. Toners and inkjet pre-qual scheme, we are looking at having something out and available to start for registration of interest in early July. Office furniture currently being considered for early in 2014. The office supply scheme for stationaries shortly thereafter in around the February timeframe in 2014. And then any remaining pre-qualification schemes, TBA at this point obviously we'll have a look at the sorts of feedback that we're getting, the way that those early schemes are running. Are there other opportunities for us to create it? I think what I would just recap, it's part of the overall thinking and design both around this contract as well as many others, is that what we're trying to do is obviously to achieve best value outcomes for the state that link to some of those reform objectives, but also I think importantly to make sure that the contract and scheme arrangements that we put in place contain enough flexibility within them so that they can cater for either changes in industry demand, they can cater for being able to introduce quite easily through things like pre-qualification schemes, new small, medium enterprise type providers. And we need to obviously get the balance right between that, because you don't want to have arrangements that are so flexible that it doesn't give you as an industry the opportunity to really be able to work with and get some firm commitments. But generally those are the kinds of things that we're trying to achieve. Now, if you've not seen that site already, we do publish all of the information both around this briefing. There'll be a video available as well as the slides from the presentation up on that website. And outside of that, if you wanted to get any additional detail or you wanted to ask a question and potentially didn't want to do that in the open forum today, you can certainly go through our client support centre at NSW by at services.nsw.gov.au. I wanted to thank you all for taking the time out to come along to the briefing. I hope you found it useful and informative. As I said, at this stage, we are still in a process of moving towards going to the market for one of those first spaces, but are keen to get feedback from you. I mean, if you do have, other than some of the questions that were raised today, if you do have some specific feedback or comment, then we flagged a couple of ways that that you can bring that back to us. But again, appreciate your taking the time out and look forward to working with you over the course of the next handful of months as we continue to develop this strategy. So thank you.